The U.S. spans 2,800 miles between the eastern seaboard and western coast. If you were to drive east to west across the country, it would take about 48 hours. While on the interstate, you'd pass by small and large towns alike. From the car window, you'd see some places that seem busy, possibly some tourist attractions, a bustling downtown, or pockets of new construction. On the other hand, you'll see several areas that look quite run down. Boarded-up houses and businesses line the pothole-ridden streets, and not much of anything seems to be going on. Rewind back 50 or 100 years, and some of these communities may have looked completely different. Take Detroit, Michigan, for example. In 1950, Detroit was home to almost 1.9 million Americans and was the fifth largest city in the U.S. While the region had its fair share of problems, Detroit was a booming hub thanks to the auto manufacturing sector.
It's true that Detroit at its peak was so much more busy with commercial centers, more jobs, more activity, more life, more housing. And the city has lost 64% of its population since then. And that fact alone, I think, has really captured the conversation about Detroit, just how much population loss there's been.
That's Michelle Wilde Anderson, a professor of property, local government, and environmental justice at Stanford Law School. She's also the author of the book, The Fight to Save the Town: Reimagining Discarded America. Today, Detroit's population is much lower, hovering at around 670,000 people. So, what happened to this once booming region? Anderson pinpoints the acceleration of this exodus to a heated election in 1973.
White Detroit lined up behind a white candidate, and Black Detroit lined up behind a Black candidate, Coleman Young, who won the mayoral race and went on to be the mayor for 2 decades. And it was that race that really drove or accelerated tremendous white flight out of the city. So you get this enormous racial exodus from the city alongside the national 1970s fall in manufacturing jobs. And so I think that's what begins the period.
This white flight, along with the relocation of several large auto companies, hit Detroit's economy hard. Fast forward to the early 2000s, and Detroit took another big blow during the financial crisis of 2008.
Michigan took a hugely disproportionate share of the early 21st century manufacturing losses. Michigan just lost so many of the jobs that America lost when China entered the WTO and there was a larger reorganization of American manufacturing. So Michigan took huge hits and Detroit took the biggest hits in the state. And then the recession came along and just slammed Detroit with increased unemployment, new rounds of job losses, and a terrible subprime mortgage crisis, which drove a lot of further foreclosures and displacement.
Anderson says that the city, along with many areas across the Rust Belt, has been hit hard from nonstop housing foreclosures and evictions. The value of many homes has plummeted due to declining populations, increased crime, and a lack of investment in education, public amenities, and more. For Detroit's predominantly working-class population, it's no longer feasible to invest in a house that needs repairs and upkeep. In effect, larger, often predatory companies are buying up this real estate and converting it into rentals.
Real estate portfolios are buying up these giant land holdings all across the Rust Belt, sort of buying properties by the hundreds to just hold them for future value. And Detroit, I think, has attracted a lot of this kind of speculation because it's such an iconic and important city. But it's a problem across a lot of older Rust Belt areas that have lost population. And so the basic problem is an inequality problem, that the land is super cheap from the point of view of what people in Detroit call New York money, but could be San Francisco, could be lots of outsiders. It's dirt cheap from the point of view of kind of median incomes elsewhere. But Detroit's own population is so poor that it's not cheap from their point of view.
Today, the majority of Detroit residents are now tenants renting month to month. Anderson says Detroit in many ways is a symbol of the bigger housing issues facing the country. Like many places, it was once possible for working-class people to afford a home, but this dream grows further out of reach year after year. Instead, residents often find themselves trapped in a situation where there's little opportunity or means to make the extra income they need to escape renting. And the local governments in these forgotten towns and cities are also in a tough spot. There's a chronic lack of investment from new companies or people moving in, let alone any revenue from tourism. Often, many residents have to travel to other areas for work. These can be places that look completely different. Take Palo Alto, for instance, a tech hub near San Francisco, California.
Palo Alto recently invested more than $76 million in renovating its libraries to have state-of-the-art technology and tech and facilities, public spaces. But meanwhile, Palo Alto is the hub for tons of hospitals and restaurants and businesses that employ low-wage workers who could never afford to live in Palo Alto or nearby suburbs. And so many of these workers live in Stockton, which I wrote about in the book. And across its worst periods of local government meltdown, Stockton couldn't afford to keep all of its modest libraries open at all. So you have this incredibly low-income city that is servicing the engine of jobs in Silicon Valley, and yet Stockton can't afford the very basic services of a library system, which is so important to kids being ready to go to kindergarten, ready to read. It's so important to adults being able to access Wi-Fi. In a place like Stockton, a library is much, much more important to basic infrastructure.
This consistent disinvestment happens in communities across the nation, making it incredibly difficult for local municipalities and residents to turn things around.
The city, too, is highly stigmatized. It's known for its poverty. It's kind of associated with violence. It's associated with unemployment. And so it's especially hard for the government and the civic institutions to kind of change the story about that place. So all of these places, they end up on lists that the media makes, like clickbait kind of lists of the most miserable places to live in America, or all kinds of storytelling about how corrupt and dangerous they are. So that's the problem that is holding these places together.
Anderson highlights that these poor communities across the U.S. vary in size, from small rural towns to larger cities. The residents can be conservative or liberal. Some places are incredibly diverse in their population, while others are almost entirely white or black. She says it's important for people not to make assumptions about a place based on its race, political beliefs, or another marker. Within many of these towns, there are residents working hard to change the narrative. Anderson says that investments in work, training, education, affordable housing, and free public resources like parks and community centers are key facets to turning things around.
Let Mayor Dan Rivera of Lawrence have the last word, in which he described how people think that you can sort of do one big grand project and kind of stop these giant problems. But he said for his administration and for the network of people that they worked with, they knew that that was just not possible. There is no silver bullet to deal with all of these chronic problems. And so instead, their goal was to do 1,000 little things, sort of keep moving forward and keep working together.
To find out more about this topic and our guest, Michelle Wilde Anderson, head to viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price. Coming up on Viewpoints.
The refugee resettlement program in this country expects refugees to achieve self-sufficiency within 90 days.
The immense challenges of building a new life in an unfamiliar place. Then,
the scale of sugar production, the scale of these land estates that we call plantations was vastly ramped up, and that enslavement became, for the first time in European history, entirely racialized.
The untold narrative of early European exploitation. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.